Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we are reading a book, or more accurately, a pamphlet that Neville wrote called The Search. We are then going to read a transcript from a vinyl record that Neville released in 1960 that discusses the secret of imagining and a mystical experience. The Search is the most complete of Neville's early mystical visions. This essay encapsulates Neville's philosophy of the omnipotence of the self. The Search also demonstrates his literary grace and power. Neville was one of the few modern writers capable of describing inner experience in a manner that is at once relatable and relevant to the reader. Neville dedicates this work to his daughter Victoria, born in 1942. For those that don't know, Neville Goddard was an amazing metaphysical writer who taught about the Bible and his own visions and the fact that imagination creates reality. And the reason you see Neville Goddard mentioned in so many places is that his teachings resonate on a deep primal level and unlock spiritual wisdom I can't even begin to explain. This is quite different than our normal episode. We've read many books and lectures, and this is a book, but a very short one, more of a pamphlet. Honestly, there's no way I can compare this to anything else that we've read or talked about with Neville. It has a poetry to it that is unlike anything else he wrote. The Search by Neville Goddard. The Search. Once in an idle interval at sea, I meditated on the perfect state and wondered what I would be were I of too pure eyes to behold iniquity, if to me all things were pure and were I without condemnation. As I became lost in this fiery brooding, I found myself lifted above the dark environment of the senses. So intense was the feeling, I felt myself a being of fire dwelling in a body of air. Voices, as from a heavenly chorus, with the exaltation of those who had been conquerors in a conflict with death, were singing, "He is risen, He is risen." And intuitively, I knew they meant me. Then I seemed to be walking in the night. I soon came upon a scene that might have been the ancient pool of Bethesda, for in this place lay a great multitude of impotent folk, blind, halt, withered, waiting not for the moving of the water as of tradition, but waiting for me. As I came near, without thought or effort on my part, they were, one after the other, molded as by the magician of the beautiful. Eyes, hands, feet, all missing members, were drawn from some invisible reservoir and molded in harmony with that perfection which I felt springing within me. When all were made perfect, the chorus exulted, "It is finished." Then the scene dissolved and I awoke. I know this vision was the result of my intense meditation upon the idea of perfection, for my meditations invariably bring about union with the state contemplated. I had been so completely absorbed within the idea that for a while I had become what I contemplated, and the high purpose with which I had for that moment identified myself drew the companionship of high things and fashioned the vision in harmony with my inner nature. The ideal with which we are united works by association of ideas to awaken 1,000 moods, to create a drama in keeping with the central idea. I first discovered this close relationship of moods to vision when I was aged about 7. I became aware of a mysterious life quickening within me like a stormy ocean of frightening might. I always knew when I would be united with this hidden identity, for my senses were expectant on the nights of these visitations, and I knew beyond all doubt that before morning I would be alone with immensity. I so dreaded these visitations that I would lie awake until my eyes from sheer exhaustion closed. As my eyes closed in sleep, I was no longer solitary, but smitten through and through with another being, and yet I knew it to be myself. It seemed older than life, yet nearer to me than my boyhood. If I tell what I discovered on these nights, I do so not to impose my ideas on others, but that I may give hope to those who seek the law of life. I discovered that my expectant mood worked as a magnet to unite me with this greater me, while my fears made it appear as a stormy sea. As a boy, I conceived of this mysterious self as might, and in my union with it, I felt its majesty as a stormy sea which drenched me, then rolled and tossed me as a helpless wave. As a man, I conceived of it as love, and myself the son of it, and in my union with it now, what a love enfolds me. It is a mirror to all, whatever we conceive, it as being that it is to us. I believe it to be the center through which all the threads of the universe are drawn. Therefore, I have altered my values and changed my ideas so that they now depend upon and are in harmony with this sole cause of all that is. It is to me that changeless reality which fashions circumstances in harmony with our concepts of ourselves. My mystical experiences have convinced me that there is no way to bring about the outer perfection we seek other than by the transformation of ourselves. As soon as we succeed in transforming ourselves, the world will melt magically before our eyes and reshape itself in harmony with that which our transformation affirms. 2 other visions I will tell, because they bear out the truth of my assertion that we, by intensity of love and hate, become what we contemplate. Once, with closed eyes made radiant from brooding, I meditated on the eternal question, who am I? And felt myself gradually dissolve into a shoreless sea of vibrant light, imagination passing beyond all fear of death. In this state, nothing existed but myself, a boundless ocean of liquid light. Never have I felt more intimate with being. How long this experience lasted, I do not know, but my return to earth was accompanied by a distinct feeling of crystallizing again into human shape. At another time, I lay on my bed, and with my eyes shut, as in sleep, I brooded on the mystery of Buddha. In a little while, the dark caverns of my brain began to grow luminous. I seemed to be surrounded by luminous clouds, which emanated from my head as fiery, pulsating rings. I saw nothing but these luminous rings for a time. Then there appeared before my eyes a rock of quartz crystal. While I gazed upon it, the crystal broke into pieces which invisible hands quickly shaped into the living Buddha. As I looked on this meditative figure, I saw that it was myself. I was the living Buddha whom I contemplated. A light like the sun glowed from this living image of myself, with increasing intensity until it exploded. Then the light gradually faded, and once more I was back within the blackness of my room. Out of what sphere or treasury of design came this being mightier than human, his garments, the crystal, the light. If I saw, heard, and moved in a world of real beings, when I seemed to myself to be walking in the night, when the lame, the halt, the blind were transformed in harmony with my inner nature, then I am justified in assuming that I have a more subtle body than the physical. A body that can be detached from the physical and used in other spheres. For to see, to hear, to move are functions of an organism, however ethereal. If I brood over the alternative that my psychic experiences were self-begotten fantasy, no less am I moved to wonder at this mightier self who flashes on my mind a drama as real as those I experience when I am fully awake. On these fiery meditations, I have entered again and again, and I know beyond all doubt that both assumptions are true. Housed within this form of earth is a body attuned to a world of light, and I have, by intense meditation, lifted it as with a magnet through the skull of this dark house of flesh. The first time I awoke, the fires within me, I thought my head would explode. There was intense vibration at the base of my skull, then sudden oblivion of all. Then I found myself clothed in a garment of light and attached by a silvery elastic cord to the slumbering body on the bed. So exalted were my feelings, I felt related to the stars. In this garment, I roamed spheres more familiar than earth, but found that, as on earth, conditions were molded in harmony with my nature. Self-begotten fantasy, I hear you say. No more so than the things of earth. I am an immortal being conceiving myself as man and forming worlds in the likeness and image of my concept of self. What we imagine that we are. By our imagination, we have created this dream of life. And by our imagination, we will re-enter that eternal world of light, becoming that which we were before we imagined the world. In the divine economy, nothing is lost. We cannot lose anything save by descent from the sphere, where the thing has its natural life. There is no transforming power in death, and whether we are here or there, we fashion the world that surrounds us by the intensity of our imagination and feeling, and we illuminate or darken our lives by the concepts we hold of ourselves. Nothing is more important to us than our conception of ourselves, and especially is this true of our concept of the deep, hidden one within us. Those that help or hinder us, whether they know it or not, are the servants of that law which shapes outward circumstances in harmony with our inner nature. It is our conception of ourselves which frees or constrains us, though it may use material agencies to achieve its purpose. Because life molds the outer world to reflect the inner arrangement of our minds, there is no way of bringing about the outer perfection we seek other than by the transformation of ourselves. No help cometh from without. The hills to which we lift our eyes are those of an inner range. It is thus to our own consciousness that we must turn as to the only reality, the only foundation on which all phenomena can be explained. We can rely absolutely on the justice of this law to give us only that which is of the nature of ourselves. To attempt to change the world before we change our concept of ourselves is to struggle against the nature of things. There can be no outer change until there is first an inner change. As within, so without. I am not advocating philosophical indifference when I suggest that we should imagine ourselves as already that which we want to be, living in a mental atmosphere of greatness, rather than using physical means and arguments to bring about the desired change. Everything we do, unaccompanied by a change of consciousness, is but futile readjustment of surfaces. However we toil or struggle, we can receive no more than our subconscious assumptions affirm. To protest against anything which happens to us is to protest against the law of our being and our rulership over our own destiny. The circumstances of my life are too closely related to my conception of myself not to have been launched by my own spirit from some magical storehouse of my being. If there is pain to me in these happenings, I should look within myself for the cause, for I am moved here and there and made to live in a world in harmony with my concept of myself. Intense meditation brings about a union with the state contemplated, and during this union we see visions, have experiences, and behave in keeping with our change of consciousness. This shows us that a transformation of consciousness will result in a change of environment and behavior. However, our ordinary alterations of consciousness, as we pass from one state to another, are not transformations, because each of them is so rapidly succeeded by another in the reverse direction. But whenever one state grows so stable as to definitely expel its rivals, then that central habitual state defines the character and is a true transformation. To say that we are transformed means that ideas previously peripheral in our consciousness now take a central place and form the habitual center of our energy. All wars prove that violent emotions are extremely potent in precipitating mental rearrangements. Every great conflict has been followed by an era of materialism and greed in which the ideals for which the conflict ostensibly was waged are submerged. This is inevitable because war evokes hate, which impels a descent in consciousness from the plane of the ideal to the level where the conflict is waged. If we would become as emotionally aroused over our ideals as we become over our dislikes, we would ascend to the plane of our ideals as easily as we now descend to the level of our hates. Love and hate have a magical transforming power, and we grow through their exercise into the likeness of what we contemplate. By intensity of hatred, we create in ourselves the character we imagine in our enemies. Qualities die for want of attention, so the unlovely states might best be rubbed out by imagining beauty for ashes and joy for mourning, rather than by direct attacks on the state from which we would be free. Whatsoever things are lovely and of good report, think on these things, for we become that with which we are en rapport. There is nothing to change but our concept of self. Humanity is a single being, in spite of its many forms and faces, and there is in it only such seeming separation as we find in our own being when we are dreaming. The pictures and circumstances we see in dreams are creations of our own imagination and have no existence save in ourselves. The same is true of the pictures and circumstances we see in this dream of life. They reveal our concepts of ourselves. As soon as we succeed in transforming self, our world will dissolve and reshape itself in harmony with that which our change affirms. The universe which we study with such care is a dream, and we, the dreamers of the dream, eternal dreamers, dreaming non-eternal dreams. One day, like Nebuchadnezzar, we shall awaken from the dream, from the nightmare in which we fought with demons, to find that we really never left our eternal home, that we were never born and have never died save in our dream. And that concludes this short and powerful booklet, The Search by Neville Goddard. In this wonderful booklet, Neville presents a powerful and deeply personal account of his mystical experiences and the profound insights they yielded about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the self. The essay encapsulates Neville's core philosophy, which emphasizes the omnipotence of the individual's imagination in shaping reality. Goddard's vivid description of his visions, such as the ancient pool of Bethesda and his transformation into the living Buddha, demonstrate his remarkable ability to convey inner experiences in a relatable and impactful manner. These visions serve as allegories for his central message that our consciousness is the sole cause of all that we experience, and that by transforming our conception of ourselves, we can reshape our world in harmony with our desires. This pamphlet explores the intimate relationship between moods and visions, suggesting that our emotional states act as magnets, drawing experiences that correspond to our inner nature. Goddard asserts that by cultivating a mood of expectancy and love, we can unite with our greater me and access a realm of boundless potential. One of the most striking aspects of The Search is Goddard's insistence on the primacy of imagination over physical reality. He argues that the outer world is merely a reflection of our inner states, and that attempting to change external circumstances without first transforming your consciousness is futile. This idea challenges conventional notions of causality and empowers you to take responsibility for your life by focusing on your internal world. What's unique about this compared to his other books that he wrote is Goddard's poetic language and metaphysical insights imbue this with a sense of timelessness and universal relevance, unlike any of his other writings. This message of self-transformation through the power of imagination resonates with me in such a powerful way. It was so beautiful to read. And in dedicating this to his daughter, he underscores the intimate and personal nature of his mystical experience, suggesting that these insights are meant to be shared and passed down to future generations. That's the powerful part of this, is he wants us to be talking about this right now. And The Search serves as a powerful introduction to his philosophy and a testament to his literary skill in conveying profound spiritual truths. It invites you to embark on your own inner journey of self-discovery and to harness the transformative power of your imagination in creating a life of abundance and love and fulfillment. You can't help but listen to this short, little, beautiful booklet and not be inspired. It's unlike anything else that I've read by Neville. For the second part of today's episode, this is a transcript of a vinyl record Neville released in 1960. As Mitch Horowitz explains, if I wanted to expose someone to one piece of Neville's work that concisely and completely describes his outlook and methods, this is what I would select. This short statement from Neville's spoken word album captures his metaphysical vision in a nutshell. The title given was The Secret of Imagining. This is different than his lecture titled The Secret of Imagining, which we have also read yet is quite wonderful. The Secret of Imagining. It may seem incredible, but it is true. The world in which we live is a world of imagination. In fact, life itself is an activity of imagining. All that we behold, though it appears without, it is within in our imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. Nothing appears or continues in being by a power of its own. Events happen because comparatively stable imaginable activities created them, and they continue in being only as long as they receive such support. Therefore, the secret of imagining is the greatest of all problems, to the solution of which everyone should aspire. For supreme power, supreme wisdom, and supreme joy lie in the solution of this great mystery. When man solves the mystery of imagining, he will have discovered the secret of causation, and that is, imagining creates reality. Divine imagining and human imagining are not two powers at all, but one. The valid distinction which exists between them lies not in the substance with which they operate, but in the degree of intensity of the operant power itself. Acting at high tension, an imaginable act is an immediate objective fact. Keyed low, an imaginable act is realized in a time process. Human history, with its forms of governments, its revolutions, its wars, and in fact the rise and fall of nations, could be written in terms of the imaginal activities of men and women. All imaginative men and women are forever casting forth enchantments, and all passive men and women who have no powerful imaginative lives are continually passing under the spell of their power. If imagination is the only thing that acts, or is in existing beings or men, as Blake believed, then we should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began that subtle change in men's minds, or that the passion, because of which the earth has been drenched in blood, did not begin in the imagination of some shepherd boy lighting up his eye for a moment before it ran upon its way. The future is the imaginable activity of man in its creative march. Imagining is the creative power, not only of the poet, the artist, the actor, and orator, but of the scientist, the inventor, the merchant, and the artisan. Its abuse in unrestrained, unlovely image-making is obvious, but its abuse in undue repression breeds a sterility, which robs a man of actual wealth of experience. Imagining novel solutions to ever more complex problems is far more noble than to restrain or kill out desire. Life is the continuing solution of a continuously synthetic problem. Imagining creates events. Our world, created out of men's imagining, comprises unnumbered warring beliefs. Therefore, there could never be a perfectly stable or static state. Today's events are bound to disturb yesterday's established order. Imaginative men and women invariably unsettle a pre-existing peace of mind. Hold fast to your ideal in your imagination. Nothing can take it from images supplied by memory and the evidence of the senses. It is creatively transformative when it imagines things as they ought to be, building its world out of the generous dreams of fancy. In the procession of images, the ones that take precedence naturally are those of the senses. Nevertheless, a present sense impression is only an image. It does not differ in nature from a memory image or the image of a wish. What makes a present sense impression so objectively real is the individual's imagination functioning in it and thinking from it, whereas in a memory image or a wish, The individual's imagination is not functioning in it or thinking from it, but is functioning out of it and thinking of it. If the individual would enter into the image in his imagination, as the design on the cover of this record suggests, then would he know what it is to be creatively transformative. Then would he realize his wish, and then he would be happy. Every image can be embodied, but unless man himself enters the image and thinks from it, it is incapable of birth. Therefore, it is the height of folly to expect the wish to be realized by the mere passage of time. That which requires imaginative occupancy to produce its effect obviously cannot be effected without such occupancy. We cannot be in one image and not suffer the consequences of not being in another. Imagination is spiritual sensation. Enter the image of the wish fulfilled. Then give it sensory vividness and tones of reality by mentally acting as you would act were it a physical fact. Now, this is what I mean by spiritual sensation. Imagine that you are holding a rose in your hand. Smell it. Do you detect the odor of roses? Well, if the rose is not here, why is its fragrance in the air? Through spiritual sensation, that is, through imaginal sight, sound, scent, taste, and touch, man can give to the image sensory vividness. If he does, all things will conspire to aid his harvesting. And on reflection, he will see how subtle were the threads that led to his goal. He could never have devised the means which his imaginal activity used to fulfill itself. If man longs to escape from his present sense fixation, to transform his present life into a dream of what might well be, he has but to imagine that he's already what he wants to be, and then feel the way he would expect to feel under such circumstances. Let him, like the make-believe of a child who is remaking the world after its own heart, create his world out of pure dreams of fancy. Let him mentally enter into his dream. Let him mentally do what he would actually do were it physically true. He will discover that dreams are realized not by the rich, but by the imaginative. Nothing stands between man and the fulfillment of his dream but facts, and facts are the creations of imagining. If man changes his imagining, he will change the facts. Man and his past are one continuous structure. This structure contains all of the facts, which have been conserved and still operate below the threshold of his surface mind. For him, it is merely history. For him, it seems unalterable, a dead and firmly fixed past. But for itself, it is living. It is part of the living age. We cannot leave behind us the mistakes of our past, for nothing disappears. Everything that has been is still in existence. The past still exists, and it gives and still gives its results. Man must go back in memory, seek for and destroy the causes of evil, however far back they lie. This going into the past and replaying a scene of the past in imagination, as it ought to have been played the first time, I call revision. And revision results in repeal. Changing our lives means changing the past. The causes of the present evil are the unrevised scenes of the past. The past and the present form the whole structure of man. It is carrying all of its contents with it. Any alteration of content will result in an alteration in the present and future. Live nobly, so that mind can store a past well worthy of recall. Should you fail to do so, remember, the first act of correction or cure is always revise. If the past is recreated into the present, so will the revised past be recreated into the present. Or else the promise that, though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow, is a lie. The question may arise as to how, by representing others to ourselves as better than they really were, or mentally rewriting a letter to make it conform to our wish, or by revising the scene of an accident, the interview with the employer, and so on, could change what seems to be the unalterable facts of the past. But remember my claims for imagining. Imagining creates reality. What it makes it can unmake. It is not only conservative, building a life from images supplied by memory. It is always creatively transformative, altering a theme already in being. The parable of the unjust steward gives the answer to this question. We can alter our world by means of a certain illegal practice, by means of a falsification of the facts. That is, by means of a certain intentional alteration of that which we have experienced. And all this is done in one's own imagination. This is a form of falsehood, which is not only not condemned, but is actually approved in the gospel teaching. By means of such falsehood, a man destroys the causes of evil and acquires friends. And on the strength of this revision proves, judging by the high praise the unjust steward received from his master, that he is deserving of confidence. Because imagining creates reality, we can carry revision to the extreme and revise a scene that would be otherwise unforgivable. We learn to distinguish between man, who is all imagination, from those states into which he may enter. An unjust steward, looking at another's distress, will represent the other to himself as he ought to be seen. Were he himself in need, he would, like the man on the cover of this record, enter his dream house in his imagination and imagine what he would see and how things would seem and how people would act after these things should be. Then in this state he would fall asleep feeling the way he would expect to feel under such circumstances. Would that all the Lord's people were unjust stewards, mentally falsifying the facts of life to deliver individuals forevermore. For the imaginal change goes forward until at length the altered pattern is realized on the heights of attainment. Our future is our imaginal activity in its creative march. Imagine better than the best you know. A couple things we can take from this powerful record is that the world we experience is fundamentally a product of imagination, not just physically, but causally. Imagining creates reality. And the distinction between divine imagination and human imagination is one of degree or intensity, not of kind. An imaginal act done with high intensity becomes an immediate objective fact. Human history and events, according to Neville, from the individual to the collective level, are shaped by imaginative activities. Highly imaginative individuals cast enchantments that unimaginative fall under the spell of. To harness the power of imagination, you must enter into and think from the state of the wish fulfilled, abandoning the old state, and persist in it until it becomes your habitual attitude. And this requires faith and love for the imagined state. Through spiritual sensation, giving imaginary acts sensory vividness, all things will conspire to make that imagined state a harvested reality. Facts are products of imagining, so changing imagination changes facts. And this allows revision, going back in memory to replay past scenes as they ought to have gone, thus changing the present and the future. The unjust steward parable illustrates the transformative power of creatively imagining and revising situations, seeing people and things as they ought to be, rather than merely as they were or are, and this kind of falsehood that delivers people from evil. From a spiritual perspective, Neville's ideas are just fascinating and continually empowering and placing ultimate responsibility and creative capacity within you, the individual. For the third part of this episode, we're going to read A Mystical Experience. This is the second side of the vinyl record released in 1960. In this lecture, Neville makes one of his earliest descriptions of his mystical experience of being born from above, which plays out as being reborn from within his skull, an event that he said awaits everyone. This talk represents Neville crossing the threshold into his latter-day career, in which he gave increasingly greater emphasis to mystical revelation. The Mystical Experience by Neville Goddard. I accept literally the saying that all the world's a stage, and I believe that God plays all the parts. The purpose of the play, to transform man, the created, into God the Creator. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith that this act of self-commission would transform man, the created into God the Creator. The play begins with the crucifixion of God on man as man and ends with the resurrection of man as God. God becomes as we are, that we may become as He is. God becomes man, that man may become first a living being and secondly a life-giving spirit. I live, yet not I, but God lives in me. And the life I know, I live in the flesh, I live by the faith of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. God took upon Himself the form of man and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross of man, and is crucified on Golgotha, the skull of man. God Himself enters death's door, the human skull, and lays down in the grave of man to make man a living being. God's mercy turned death into sleep. Then began the prodigious and unthinkable metamorphosis of man, the transformation of man into God. No man unaided by the crucifixion of God could cross the threshold that admits to conscious life. But now we have union with God in His crucified self. He lives in us as our wonderful human imagination. Therefore man is all imagination, and God is man and exists in us and we in Him. The eternal body of man is the imagination. That is God Himself. When He rises in us, we will be like Him and He will be like us. Then all impossibilities will dissolve at the touch of exaltation, which His rising in us will impart to our nature. Here is the secret of the world. God died to give man life and to set man free. For however clearly God is aware of His creation, it does not follow that man, imaginatively created, is aware of God. To work this miracle, God had to die, then rise again as man. And none has ever expressed it so clearly as Blake. Blake says, or rather, has Jesus say, "Unless I die, thou canst not live. But if I die, I shall arise again, and thou with me. Wouldest thou love one who never died for thee, or ever die for one who had not died for thee? And if God dieth not for man, and giveth not Himself eternally for man, man could not exist. So God died. That is to say, God has freely given Himself for man. Deliberately, He has become man and has forgotten that He is. God, in the hope that man, thus created, will eventually rise as God. God has so completely offered His own self for man that He cries out on the cross of man, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He has completely forgotten that He is God. But after God rises in one man, that man will say to his brothers, "Why stand we here trembling around, calling on God for help, and not ourselves, in whom God dwells?" This first man that has been raised from the dead is known as Jesus, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For man, God died. Now by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. Jesus resurrects His dead Father by becoming Him. In Adam, the universal man, God sleeps. In Jesus, the individualized God, God wakes. In waking, man the created has become God the Creator, and can truly say, "Before the world was, I am." Just as God, in His love for man, so completely identified Himself with man that He forgot that He was God, so man in his love for God must so completely surrender himself to God that he lives the life of God and no longer that of man. God's play, which transforms man into God, is revealed to us in the Bible. It is completely consistent in imagery and symbolism. The New Testament is hid in the Old Testament, and the Old is manifested in the New. The Bible is a vision. It is not a doctrine or a ritual. The Old Testament tells us of God's promises. The New Testament tells us not how these promises were fulfilled, but how they are fulfilled. The central theme of the Bible is the direct, individual, mystical experience of the birth of the child, that child of whom the prophet spoke. To us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. When the child is revealed to us, we see it, we experience it, and the response to this revelation can be stated in the words of Job. I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. The story of the Incarnation is not fable, allegory, or some carefully reasoned formula to enslave the minds of men, but mystical fact. It is a personal mystical experience of the birth of oneself out of one's own skull, symbolized in that of a child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying on the floor. There is a distinction between hearing of this birth of a child from one's own skull, a birth which no scientist or historian could ever possibly explain, and actually experiencing the birth, holding in your own hands and seeing with your own eyes this miraculous child, a child born from above, out of your own skull, a birth contrary to all the laws of nature. The event, as it is recorded in the Gospels, actually takes place in man. But of that day or that hour, when the time will come for the individual to be delivered, no one knows but the Father. Do not marvel that I say to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it wills, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. This revelation in the Gospel of John is true. Here is my experience of this birth from above. Like Paul, I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the actual mystical experience of being born from above. None can speak truly of this mystical birth from above, but the one who has experienced it. I had no idea that this birth from above was literally true, for who before the experience could believe that the child, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, was inwoven in his own skull, who, before the experience, would understand that his Maker is his husband and the Lord of hosts is his name? Who would believe that the Creator went in unto his own creation, man, and knew it to be himself, and that this entrance into the skull of man, this union of God and man, resulted in the birth of a son out of the skull of man, which birth gave to that man eternal life and union with his Creator forever? If I now tell what I experienced that night, I do so not to impose my ideas on others, but that I may give hope to those who, like Nicodemus, wonder, how can a man be born when he is old? How can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? How can this be? Well, this is how it happened to me. A heavenly dream in which the arts flourished was suddenly interrupted by the most intense vibration centered at the base of my skull. Then a drama, as real as those I experience when I am fully awake, began to unfold. I felt myself within my skull, trying to force my way out through its base. Something gave way, and I felt myself move head downward through the base of my skull. I squeezed myself out inch by inch. When I was almost out, I held what I took to be the foot of the bed and pulled the remaining portion of me out of my skull. There on the floor, I laid for a few seconds. Then I rose and looked at my body on the bed. It was lying on its back and tossing from side to side like one in recovery from a great ordeal. As I contemplated it, hoping that it would not fall off the bed, I became aware that the vibration which started the whole drama was not only in my head, but now was also coming from the corner of the room. As I looked over to the corner, I wondered if that vibration could be caused by a very high wind, a wind strong enough to vibrate the window. I could not believe that the vibration which I still felt within my head was related to that which seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. Looking back to the bed, I discovered that my body was gone, but in its place sat my 3 oldest brothers. My oldest brother sat where the head was. My second and third brothers sat where the feet were. None seemed to be aware of me, although I was aware of them and could discern their thoughts. I suddenly became aware of the reality of my own invisibility. I noticed that they, too, were disturbed by the vibration coming from the corner of the room. My third brother was the most disturbed and went over to investigate the cause of the disturbance. His attention was attracted by something on the floor, and looking down he announced, "It is Neville's baby." My other two brothers, in most incredulous voices, asked, "How can Neville have a baby?" My brother lifted the infant wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid him on the bed. I then, with my invisible hands, lifted the babe and asked him, "How is my sweetheart?" He looked into my eyes and smiled, and I awoke in this world to ponder this greatest of my many mystical experiences. One other vision I will tell, because it bears out the truth of my assertion that the Bible is mystical fact, that everything written about the promised child is in the law of Moses, and the prophets, and the Psalms, and it must be mystically experienced in the imagination of the individual. The child's birth is a sign and a portent, signaling the resurrection of the patriarchs in the imagination of him in whom the child is born. 6 months after the birth of the child, a vibration similar to the one which preceded his birth started in my head. This time its intensity was centered at the top of my head. Then came a sudden explosion, and I found myself in a modestly furnished room. There, leaning against the side of an open door, was my son David of biblical fame. He was a lad about 12 years old. What struck me forcibly about him was the unusual beauty of his face and figure. He was, as he is described in the first book of Samuel, ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and very handsome. Not for one moment did I feel myself to be anyone other than Neville. Yet I knew that this lad David was my son, and he knew that I was his father. As I sat there contemplating the beauty of my son, the vision faded, and I awoke. What conclusion can be reached from these mystical experiences? A chamber of man's image, in man's imagination, is engraved with every patriarch and character in the Old Testament, and that after the birth of a child out of the skull of man, signifying that man's rebirth from above, there will begin the resurrection of the patriarchs. Each in his turn will be revealed as the son of the man who resurrects him. When all are resurrected from the dead, that man in whom they are resurrected will know himself to be of the Elohim, the God who became man, that man may become God. So in this final reading, we get Neville fully talking about the promise, as he did in many lectures, describing his own mystical experience, which many thought was completely out of left field compared to his earlier lectures, even if you compare it to what we read earlier with The Secret of Imagining. You can take from it what you will. But all three of these wonderful readings are so amazing and carry the whole breadth of Neville, from his mystical experiences to his practical teaching on The Secret of Imagining. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and welcome to The Reality Revolution.